Well, hello everyone. My name is Zachary O'Shea, and this is Box of Teeth. This month we're going over a universal antagonist that you can use for a horror-themed Dungeons & Dragons game, La Contessa. I want to go over how I built her using my usual method. As a reminder, La Contessa is a noblewoman who has used strange science and alchemical means to change herself into an undead horror of sorts, so she can continue to hunt her hated foes, vampires, and sentient undead in general. She's lost everything over the years, her friends, her family, her country, to this undead scourge, and this has really skewed her morality. All that she has left is the hunt, her hatred, and her intellect. Whenever I build a monster, I use the same order of operations, which breaks down to Noctis: name, origin, comparison, traits, inform, and so up. And I want to walk through creating Contessa in that sort of way, because I think it will help you build your own homebrew monsters, or even take an established monster and give them a specific personality and maybe a few extra traits for your Dungeons & Dragons or other role-playing game. Let's start with name. This is a bit of an easy one. She is basically an amalgamation of Count Dracula and Van Helsing that is rolled into one, and La Contessa is, of course, the Countess, and I think that's just an easiest way as a moniker to identify her. As with the rest of Universal Antagonists, she's not given a specific name. It's up to someone to give them a name for their campaign that really fits and flesh out the rest of the personality so it, again, fits the world that they're presenting. Next, we move on to origin, and from here forward, we really have to take into account the horror subgenres she represents, which is scientific horror, gothic horror, and vampire horror. And we have some initial aspects of her character that fit really neatly into those. She's a noblewoman, she's an alchemical genius, and she's an undead horror. So you have to make sure that she has the right skills you would expect a noblewoman to have, as well as someone who deals with alchemy and the like, which means she's probably going to be a little bit of an artificer. And undead horror-wise, she needs to have the right sort of condition immunities and damage immunities and dark vision and the like that your players would expect an undead creature to have. Of course, I am going to modify those a little bit from the normal damage condition immunities because of her alchemical nature. So she's only resistant to necrotic damage, but she's immune to fire damage because he plays with a lot of alchemical substances and the like. Next is comparison. So I'm going to look at creatures of the same challenge rating, especially undead creatures, and keeping vampires in mind to make sure things such as her hit points and armor class are correct. For example, she has a bit of a lower armor class than average because she's only wearing studded leather, but she has more hit points to compensate for that. And again, what sort of saving throw bonuses should she have? What's the good range for that? That's just really what I'm talking about here, but also some of the traits. Like she probably needs regeneration, for example, and she needs a way to feed off of people, but instead of doing it by drinking blood, which is vampire horror, we're going to shift that over to a scientific horror where she's draining the essential salts from people and reducing them to piles of dust in the end, which for me is just kind of reminiscent of Lovecraft's Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward. So it plays into multiple angles of horror at once. The same plays into her traits. She does have innate spellcasting, but they're more of an artificer feel, even though they are definitely necromancy. And she does have turn immunity because she's not a normal kind of undead. And of course, powerful undead often have turn immunity, but she specifically does because she's made through scientific means, not the usual necromantic death magic way of doing things. Another trait that vampires have, of course, is their charming gaze, but for her, that didn't really make sense, and I wanted to go with more of a science horror angle. So she's discovered how to distill a ghoul's ability to paralyze people down into its very essence, and has injected a version of that into her eyes instead, so she can paralyze at a glance. Again, kind of like how a Medusa turns people to stone, but not quite as powerful. Then we move on to inform, which is really, I want to hammer home her genius and kind of her weird science gothic horror feel, where she has a blade that she uses that is actually a mimic and can change from sword to whip as needed, which again kind of plays into that gothic vampire horror feel that you often get in movies, and it can even grab other weapons and pull them out of the hand whenever it parries. Lastly, she has a strange alchemical substance for her blood, so she has the ability of mercy where she can use her blood to heal the living or to hurt the undead. And that informs her character as well, because there's still a little kernel of her that wants to save people. They're being hunted and harmed by the undead, but unfortunately, that part of her isn't very strong anymore. In the last bit of Inform, I really want to make sure that people understand that she is someone who uses science to her advantage. We've touched on a little bit with the switching vampire tropes to something more scientific, but she just straight up has alchemical bombs that she throws at people, and you'll get more kind of wacky fantasy science than something that can do force damage or fire damage or poison damage, depending on what sort of grenade that they end up throwing. The last up, as always, is the simple one. It is sew up. So it's just going through and making sure all the DC numbers are correct, the damage that she does is right, her hit dice and her hit points match, that sort of thing. So all the numbers are there, so you're presenting a fair creature for the challenge rating that it is when your players inevitably fight it. That might take a while with Law Contessa, of course, because the idea is at first the player characters might be on her side until her lack of morality get in the way. But knowing player characters and their tendency to do things like, say, burning down orphanages or the like, just because it's the most expedient way to get rid of evil, hopefully your players aren't like that, well, they might just go along with her after all. I really hope this was helpful. Again, just kind of going through the steps that I use, the order of operations. When I'm building a monster, everybody has their own, but I find if you take the time to write them down and follow the steps every single time, you make more solid homebrew monsters, whether that's for Dungeons & Dragons or any horror role-playing game, or really any horror role-playing game that you're working on. Again, I would love to hear how you would use Law Contessa down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed her. You can always find her, all of her minions, and hundreds of other horror-themed monsters, all for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that are all perfectly free at boxofteeth.blogspot.com. If you're more interested in the other horror role-playing projects that I have that aren't Dungeons & Dragons, or the horror fiction that I write that includes grease paint right here, you can always go to www.zacharyoshay.com. As always, as well, I do appreciate your time and your attention, and have a wonderful rest of the day.